Hey, it's Drybear. Another week has come and went, so it's time to check in on our DPS rankings for week 7. And this one I've been excited for because this is post 10.0.5, where many classes had their talent trees reworked, rebalanced, changed, reintroduced with new abilities, new talents, and things reworked, as well as buffs and nerfs going across all the classes in the game. So this one's going to be a big shakeup relative to last week. So we'll look at where the DPS specializations stack up against each other in PvE. If you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. And we'll start, as we always do, by reminding ourselves where everything was last week. Again, this data comes from Warcraft logs. These are using the max logs over the course of 2 weeks, though for this week, we're just going to use since the last patch. So just this week, so we can see where the classes stack up. But this is where they were last week in week 6. Some major changes that we know went into the game. We know Frost and Fire Mage got a 5% buff. There were some buffs that went to Warlock. Shadow Priest got some surprising buffs that no one really expected, but they got them anyway. We know that Marksmanship had some major changes. They lost one of their most core and beloved abilities, Double Tap, so that one's gone. And then across the board, we saw some other changes that kind of just shifted people up. Fury and Arms Warrior especially, got some really nice buffs that should help them out overall. And then we didn't really see too much for classes like Survival Hunter or Beastmaster Hunter in that case. So let's see where everything changed and where we line up in week 7. And boom, the long-awaited week 7 DPS rankings based on parses since the patch in Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and Mythic Plus. Again, I like including Heroic Raid because the group size varies, the difficulty doesn't constrict you from performing a specific way, and Mythic Raid has a fixed group size of 20, and the difficulty, like, people have to do mechanics. You can't ignore them, you can't cheat them, you can't circumvent them, you have to do mechanics in Mythic. So that usually kind of constrains where the classes go, whereas Heroic Raid is kind of like, do whatever you want, have whatever group size you want, you know, just have some free time. And then Mythic Plus obviously is the 5-man timed challenge content going through the dungeons. So let's talk about this week. This is a huge shakeup for many classes. A lot going on here. We're going to go in order of the right side. So right side has all of their scores in each category stacked up together. So you can see, you know, across PvE, which specs are doing the best. Shockingly, the first thing to talk about, Outlaw Rogue and Subtlety Rogue have been owning the first and second slot overall since the launch of Season 1. They've just been dominating, but some new classes, some new specializations are popping up here. In the first slot is Enhancement Shaman. Now, they aren't first in Mythic Plus or Mythic Raid or Heroic Raid, but they're in third or fourth in all of them. So because they're so consistently good, they don't have this major swing across it. I mean, it's based on the numbers this week, you can bring an Enhancement Shaman to any style of PvE content and they will dominate as long as they're playing properly. Obviously, they just are performing incredibly well. So Enhancement Shaman in the first slot. Devastation Evoker is actually in the second slot here, primarily because of their raid performance. Their parses in raid this week were bonkers. They actually took the second slot in Mythic Raid and in Heroic Raid, which means that when the group size is constrained and mechanics can't be skipped, it didn't seem to bother them much. They're in the exact same ranking position in either raid setup. So the buffs that went in for Devastation Evoker, I mean, they've had like, I think 4 patches in a row. They got buffs. They've just been buffed. So here we are. They are still below average in Mythic Plus. They still struggle with Mythic Plus. They don't stack up to the rest of the specializations when it comes to pushing those keys higher and higher, but they do well, extremely well in raid this week, which is encouraging because previously they were below average in every area. So the buffs that they got seem to make them better in raid. In the third slot is Shadow Priest. And again, I don't know why they felt like they needed to buff Shadow. I feel like they were doing well, and Shadow has always been a spec that gets better and better the longer the season goes on because they can min-max their gear and get everything just right. They got some big changes where a lot of their non-spec specific abilities, like their class tree abilities, also now give them insanity, and they had some buffs in the last class tuning as well. But this week in DPS, Shadow was number 3 overall and number 1 in Mythic Raid. They are still around top 3 for Mythic Plus. They get overshadowed, pun intended, by some of the other specializations. But in Raid, played to its best, they are outparsing every other specialization in the game right now, and they're clocking it at number 3 overall, primarily because of their Mythic Plus score. In the 4th slot, we have Havoc, which, just like Enhancement, they were able to take the 4th slot overall just because they're insanely consistent. They are 5th in Heroic Raid, 5th in Mythic Raid, and 6th in Mythic Plus. They perform equally well in all styles of content. The style of content doesn't seem to impact their performance at all. They're just insanely good, one of the best in the game. They didn't really receive any major changes, but they've just been consistent and sticking with it. Windwalker is in the 5th slot overall, primarily because of their Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus scoring there. They have always been good in Mythic Plus. Usually Mage, Rogue, Windwalker has like always been the thing. Balanced Druid also very good for Mythic Plus. You can see that Windwalker parses in the top 4 for Mythic Raid, but about average for Heroic Raid, which means that when left to their own devices, when mechanics can be skipped and group size can be cheated, other classes outparse them, which means that typically the way I look at this is that the damage output that they have, on a dummy may be less than the classes above them in Heroic Raid, but when you have to do mechanics and move around and be useful while you're dealing damage, Windwalker is insanely good. They have high mobility, they can teleport, they can flying serpent kick, they can roll, they have tons of ways to deal with it, they have good ranged interrupts, they have knockbacks, ring of peace, stuns, they have so many different ways to be useful instantaneously, and then get right back to damage. So in difficult content, Windwalker is insanely good. And then Heroic Raid, more lower difficulty parsing, they're not as good, but if the difficulty is high, they're insanely good. Underneath Windwalker is Balanced Druid. This one, I was kind of shocked to see them not have any major changes going into the last patch. They are number 4 for Mythic Plus, nothing surprising there. They have always been good in Mythic Plus, and I'm assuming that ever since the Catalyst went out, that's the other thing to think about as well. You would imagine that anyone that is doing well, that didn't have their 4-set bonus for their class, should have been able to get it this week with the Catalyst. And Balanced Druid is actually one of the best and most impactful 4-set bonuses out of all the DPS specs. It makes a big difference for balance. So it's possible that there were some that were underutilizing. They just got super unlucky with their drops and their vaults. They couldn't get the 4-set bonus, and the Catalyst turned the corner. But overall, they're just doing insanely well. They do better in Mythic Plus, significantly better, but they do in the top 3rd for Mythic Raid and Heroic Raid. Underneath Balance is Arcane Mage, slowly slipping. They were in the top 5 and had been in the top 5 for all of Season 1. And then in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, they've just been, they got knocked down. I think this is a combination of them not receiving any major strength increases in the last patch, as well as other classes getting a bunch of buffs. But they, in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, in difficult content, Arcane did not do as well this week. However, they are still at the top of Heroic Raid, which means that if they can stand still on their little sigil of power and be undisturbed, and no one, their phone's on D&D and no one can message them, they can parse like crazy. But when they actually have to do other stuff, they are not doing as well inside of that. Underneath Arcane is Outlaw Rogue, shockingly. They are still the best in Mythic Plus. I don't see that changing because they're so useful. Subtlety is in the same boat. But in Heroic Raid and Mythic Raid, they fell down significantly. They used to be number 1 in Mythic Raid and like number 2 in Heroic Raid. All the rogue specs are way down in Heroic Raid. In Mythic Raid, they are still in the top 6, but significantly lower than what they were. And Outlaw still performing insanely well in Mythic Plus. Arms Warrior got a bunch of buffs. They got like 2 or 3 patches in a row where they just kept getting buffs, and they got their biggest ones in the last patch with the 10.0.5. So now in every category, Arms is outperforming Fury. Arms at the start of the season was down in the bottom 3rd, maybe even like bottom 4th. And they had been struggling a lot. Fury started the season in the top 5. They were up there with Havoc and Windwalker. And over time, over the first 6 weeks of the season, they just slipped and slipped and slipped. They're still slipping. They're lower than they were last week. And so they're still struggling. But Arms seems to benefit greatly from the buffs that they got. And overall, they're sitting right underneath Outlaw Rogue on overall performance, doing pretty well in Mythic Plus, pretty well in Mythic Raid, and then, you know, in the bottom of the top third for Heroic Raid. Underneath Arms is Unholy DK. Unholy DK, when left alone in Heroic Raid, is the top 3. When difficulty comes into a factor, they're about average, and they actually did really poorly. Both DK specs did really poorly this week in Mythic Plus. This week is Fortified, Bursting, Storming. So it's possible that, you know, with Bursting, Raging, you can't really like go ham and do Festering Wounds on everything. You need to evenly distribute your damage, or you need to single target to avoid that affix. So it could just be a bad week for DKs in general, because you can't just like hit AoE button and win. Plus it's Fortified, so there's extra add issues to go into that. But when it came to Mythic Plus this week, Unholy did not do well. They still did fine in Mythic Raid, and they did great in Heroic Raid as well. Underneath Unholy is Subtlety Rogue. Then just like Outlaw, the story is the same. They got bumped down since the 10.0.5, which I have a feeling is mainly because other classes got bumped up and they didn't. I think they just got outscaled. There wasn't really any major changes to Outlaw or Subtlety that nerfed them into the ground or, you know, should have shifted it. I think it just took other classes. Everyone else got nice buffs and they didn't. So by comparison, they were dropped down. Still doing great in Mythic Plus and Mythic Raid. And just like Outlaw in Heroic Raid, they are parsing quite poorly, which could just be, you know, people group size or skill floor, people not performing at the class's best. Demonology underneath Subtlety, just like Fury, Demonology started the season strong, incredibly strong, slipped down to about average, and then has been kind of working its way up and down and back and forth, kind of dancing with the performance lines there. They're about average overall. They do better in Heroic Raid, and they do well in Mythic Plus, but in Mythic Raid, they are actually struggling quite a lot this week. Elemental Shaman in the middle on this here. Kind of surprising. They hadn't really been doing well at all this season. Throughout the entire season, they were in the bottom third. They're still in that for Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, but they were parsing well this week in Heroic Raid. Retribution Paladin. We saw them in the bottom for most of the season. They got some major buffs to several of their main core abilities, including one of their big nuke abilities, AoE nuke abilities. And they did well in Mythic Raid, and they stayed doing well. I mean, they were in the top 4 after those buff changes, and then they're still, I mean, look at the standard deviation. They're still very close to the upper echelon with that. You can see how close the scoring is for Retribution, even though they are in the bottom of the middle third. And then they do about average in Mythic Plus, about average in Heroic Raid, which is much better than what they had before. They were in the very bottom for Mythic Plus. So overall, they have come up on average and are doing better than they were before. Fire Mage and Frost Mage have been getting buffs for the last like 3 or 4 patches. And then they got another 5% overall buff. Like the previous patches, they were getting like Flame Strike, Pyroblast, you know, just buffs to their core abilities in damage. And then in 10.0.5, they just got a flat 5% damage to everything, which was another buff on top of the buffs they already got. They were struggling. They were in the bottom 5 in all categories, and they've come up a bit. And shockingly, Fire actually outperformed Arcane in Mythic Raid this week. So they're actually almost tied with Arcane in Mythic Plus. So I think people are just trying out Fire and maybe putting pause on their Arcane, so there might be less parses for Arcane as people test the new changes in Fire and Frost. But Fire actually did pretty dang well in Mythic Raid this week. They did okay-ish in Heroic Raid, and they didn't do completely awful in Mythic Plus. So Fire might be on the rise. Fury Warrior underneath Fire Mage. Fury Warrior has kind of solidified itself as being average, even though they've been getting some love over the last 2 balance changes or so. Like I said, they started the season high, and now in week 7, they're slightly below average. Nothing super great there. And I still wonder if the 4-set bonus for Fury is just not providing enough relative to other classes. It doesn't seem like there's something missing for Fury Warrior and previously for Arms, but Arms got super buffed, and I guess that was insanely effective for them. Frost DK underneath Fury Warrior. They are doing okay in Heroic Raid and pretty poorly in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus. Though again, Unholy has been outperforming Frost in a lot of content. Unholy also had a bad week this week, and it could just be that the affixes this week in Mythic Plus do not favor Death Knights in general. And the score generation, the score split for Mythic Plus is actually pretty good. It's closer than it was before, but this week Frost DK in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus did not do as well. Underneath Frost DK is Marksmanship Hunter. If you go back to the start of the video and you look where Marksmanship was last week, the double tap, like removal of double tap and the talent changes for Marksmanship hurt them pretty bad. Like, I don't think that they weren't really in a position where they needed to be nerfed. I don't know. I'm feeling like they removed double tap just because it was so bursty in PvP and they wanted to remove that as an option for them. But they're kind of down. Actually, Marksmanship is losing to BM in Heroic Raid and Mythic Plus. They're holding on to their below average scoring in Mythic Raid this week, but the changes really hurt them bad, and it doesn't get any better for the following ones. Underneath Marksmanship is Beast Mastery in the overall, partially because they did better in Mythic Plus and Heroic Raid this week, but Beast Mastery and Mythic Raid in the bottom 4. They're definitely struggling just as much. Affliction Warlock is not the worst spec in the game anymore. Right at the bottom, we actually had a few weeks where Affliction Warlock was the worst parser in Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and Mythic Plus. They've come up off that floor. They're actually doing much better in Raid than they were before. They're still in the bottom 3rd, but they're at least getting parses. They're actually outperforming Demonology in Mythic Raid. And then in Mythic Plus, they are... they're doing bad. It's in the bottom 3. It's pretty rough. So not super great for Affliction, but it's promising it's better than it was. Feral Druid took a major hit. Feral Druid was doing about average, just above average in Raid. Going into this patch after the 10.0.5 changes, they are now in the bottom 5, bottom 6. They are not feeling good in Raid this week. They did not perform well. They're struggling a bit. They're still in the top, what is that? Top 7 for Mythic Plus, which is encouraging. Druids in general are always going to be really good at Mythic Plus. They have so many tools that make Mythic Plus awesome for them. And they're still doing well there, but not so great in Raid this week, unfortunately. Underneath Feral Druid is Destruction Warlock. Destruction came up a bit. Actually, they were buffed, I think, twice in a row. And they started performing really well in Mythic Plus. So Mythic Plus, Demonology, and Destruction, they're actually in a really good spot. They do amazingly. They bring health stones, which is nice. They can even summon skip in some cases, and they have some really nice utility and CC and things like that. And Destruction does great in Mythic Plus. They're still struggling a lot in Raid. Mythic Raid, they're in the bottom 3. Heroic Raid, they're in the bottom 5. So hopefully we still see more buffs coming for them that help improve their Raid performance. But they're doing a lot better than they were in Mythic Plus, so that's encouraging. Underneath the Destruction is Frost Mage. Just like Fire, Frost Mage got plenty of buffs to their abilities, and then they got the overall 5% buff to their damage. It didn't seem to have much of an impact in Mythic Plus or in Heroic Raid, which tells me that they're just not doing enough damage, just raw damage data. But I guess a lot of Mage players are hoping it's not Arcane this week, and you can tell by Mythic Raid. I have a feeling that all the highest performing Mage players with the best gear this week just kind of flocked to Fire and Frost, and they pushed it as hard as they could to see what they could get out of it for Mythic this week. Of course, you only get one chance to do Mythic. Once you've completed it for the week, you don't get any more parses. So I'm guessing if you went with your regular guild for Mythic and you were normally an Arcane Mage, I'm guessing a lot of mages were like, okay, let me try Fire, let me try Frost this week. Let's see how it stacks up. And it did okay, about average in Mythic Raid, and Arcane kind of dropped down a bit, but I have a feeling that most mages have been testing that out. Down underneath Frost Mage in the second to last position is Assassination Rogue. I don't know exactly what happened. Assassination had previously always been very low in Mythic Raid, very low in Mythic Plus. For some reason, in Heroic Raid, they were parsing insanely well. And with the changes in 10.0.5 this week, they did not. So The only category they were doing well in previously was Heroic Raid, and that seems to have gone away this week, so now they're just down in the dumps. And sadly, this is so sad. Look at the right side of the screen. At the very bottom, you can see how it's kind of like this very smooth trend line going from Enhancement all the way down to Destruction Warlock. Then there's this noticeable deviation after Destruction Warlock down into like this lower cohort for Frost Mage and Assassination. And look how big the difference in line is from Assassination Rogue, the second worst in the game right now, to Survival Hunter. Survival Hunter is struggling. And I think they actually have an amazing kit. I love playing my Survival Hunter. I think they're a lot of fun. I enjoy it. I think they just don't do enough damage for their rotation. If you master your Wildfire Bomb and use the 3 different types properly and line everything up just right, and you get enough procs and you get everything rotating, you're able to, get your Mongoose up to 5 and then use, if you get it all right, I guess they're just not doing enough damage. So they are this week where Affliction was several weeks back. They are the lowest performers in Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and Mythic Plus across the board this week. So pour one out for Survival. They need some love, and hopefully they receive it in the next patch. But let me know down below what you think, if this is what you expected going into 10.0.5, now that we have a week of data to look at. Super cool, super interesting, a lot of shakeups. We love it. I don't know, I like having difference. It's nice to have variety and things changing and all that stuff. I know some people, obviously, if you didn't benefit from 10.0.5 like the others, maybe you didn't like it, maybe you did. Let me know your thoughts down below. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.